Something's growing on my back," the child whispered, his small fingers tracing the deadly mass beneath his threadbare shirt. Dr. Ethan Callaway's hands trembled as he examined the tumor, the same merciless disease that had stolen his own son 2 years prior. In that moment, staring into Nathan's trusting eyes, Ethan faced an impossible choice: turn away another dying child, or open his shattered heart to inevitable loss once more. This is a story of unexpected grace found in the darkest of places. Stay with me until the end, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1882 settled over western Kansas like a fever that wouldn't break. The wheat fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, their golden stalks bending and swaying in the hot wind that carried nothing but dust and the memory of better times. On the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, where the prairie began its relentless march toward the horizon, stood a farmhouse that had once known laughter. Dr. Ethan Callaway sat on his porch steps, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his fingers like a lifeline to oblivion. At 42, he looked a decade older, his dark hair streaked with premature silver, his once steady surgeon's hands now prone to tremors that had nothing to do with age. The morning sun beat down on his weathered face, but he felt nothing hadn't felt much of anything since that terrible day 2 years ago, when the consumption finally claimed his boy. Joseph. The name still cut through him like a blade between the ribs. The farm around him told the story of a man who had given up. Weeds choked the vegetable garden that his late wife Sarah had tended with such care. The barn door hung askew on its hinges, and the chicken coop stood empty, its wire mesh torn and useless. Even the old oak tree that had once held Joseph's rope swing now stood bare, its lower branches sawed off in a fit of grief-fueled rage that Ethan barely remembered. He raised the bottle to his lips and let the whiskey burn away the taste of another sleepless night. The irony wasn't lost on him. A doctor who couldn't heal his own son now drinking himself toward the same grave that had swallowed his family whole. The good people of Cedar Ridge had stopped coming around months ago, their offers of help and comfort eventually wearing thin against his stubborn isolation. The sound of wagon wheels on the dusty road made him look up, squinting against the glare. A familiar figure drove toward his gate, tall, lean, dressed in the simple black of a country preacher. Ethan's jaw tightened as he recognized Reverend Gabriel Wilson, his old friend from the war, the one man who refused to let him sink completely into the darkness. Gabriel brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down slowly, favoring his left leg, a reminder of the Confederate bullet that had nearly taken it off at Antietam. But it was what he lifted from the wagon bed that made Ethan's blood run cold. A boy. Maybe 8 or 9 years old, thin as a fence post with dark hair that stuck up at odd angles, despite obvious attempts to tame it. The child's clothes were clean but patched, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. "Ethan!" Gabriel called out, his voice carrying that familiar note of gentle authority that had once rallied broken soldiers on blood-soaked battlefields. "I need to talk to you." Ethan didn't rise from the steps. "Whatever you're selling, Gabriel, I'm not buying, especially if it comes with a sermon attached." The Reverend approached the porch, the boy trailing behind him like a shadow. Up close, Ethan could see the telltale signs, the pale complexion, the slight shortness of breath, the way the child unconsciously favored his left side. His trained eye cataloged the symptoms with clinical detachment, even as his heart began to race. "This is Nathan," Gabriel said simply. "Nathan Rivers. He's been staying at the church for the past month." The boy stepped forward with surprising dignity for someone so young. "Pleased to meet you, sir," he said, his voice soft but clear. There was something in his eyes, a kind of old-soul weariness that no child should possess, mixed with a stubborn spark of life that refused to be extinguished. Ethan's hands clenched around the whiskey bottle. "No, you haven't heard what I'm asking yet. I don't need to." Ethan stood abruptly, nearly stumbling as the alcohol hit his bloodstream. "The answer is no, Gabriel. Take the boy somewhere else." Nathan looked between the two men, his expression thoughtful rather than hurt. "It's all right, Reverend Wilson. I told you he wouldn't want me here." Something in the child's matter-of-fact acceptance twisted in Ethan's chest like a knife. The boy spoke as if rejection was expected, as if he'd learned not to hope for kindness from a world that had given him precious little of it. Gabriel's weathered face creased with frustration. Ethan, just listen for 1 minute. The boy has nowhere else to go. The orphanage in Topeka is full, and the one in Kansas City. He paused, glancing at Nathan. Well, let's just say they're not equipped for children with special needs. Special needs, Ethan repeated flatly. Is that what we're calling it now? The Reverend's expression hardened. He's dying, Ethan. We both know it. The tumor on his back is growing, and Dr. Henderson says it's only a matter of time. Nathan's small hand moved instinctively to his left shoulder blade, a gesture so familiar it was clearly habitual. Pa, something's growing on my back, he said quietly, the words carrying an echo of innocence lost. That's what I told my father before he brought me to the church, before he said he couldn't take care of me anymore. The simple statement hit Ethan like a physical blow. He saw his own Joseph in that moment, remembered the night his son had come to him with similar words, the beginning of the end that had torn their family apart. The whiskey bottle slipped from his fingers and shattered on the porch boards, amber liquid spreading like spilled blood. I can work, Nathan continued, apparently unfazed by Ethan's reaction. I'm good with animals, and I can read and write. I won't be a burden. Gabriel stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone he'd once used to talk wounded soldiers through their darkest moments. I'm not asking you to save him, Ethan. God knows we both learned in the war that some battles can't be won. I'm asking you to give him a place to spend whatever time he has left. A place where he's not just another charity case or a problem to be managed. Ethan stared at the boy, seeing past the careful composure to the fear underneath. Nathan was trying so hard to be brave, to make himself acceptable, useful, worthy of basic human kindness. It was a burden no child should have to carry yet. This one wore it with a grace that shamed every adult who had failed him. How long? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel glanced at Nathan, then back to his friend. Henderson thinks maybe 3 months. Could be longer, could be shorter. There's no way to know for sure. 3 months. Joseph had lasted 6 after the diagnosis, each day a battle against hope and despair. Ethan remembered the way his son had grown thinner and paler, the way laughter had become precious because it came so rarely, the way hope had slowly drained from Sarah's eyes until there was nothing left but resignation and grief. I can't, he said, shaking his head. Gabriel, I can't go through that again. Nathan stepped forward, his chin raised with quiet determination. I'm not asking you to love me, sir. I know that place is taken. I just need somewhere to stay until it's time. The words were spoken with such simple dignity that Ethan felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. This child, this brave, abandoned little soul, was asking for so little. Not love, not hope for a miracle, just basic shelter and human decency in his final months. Gabriel sensed the shift in his friend's resolve. 3 days, he said quietly. Just give it 3 days. If it's too much, I'll find somewhere else for him. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Every rational part of his mind screamed against it. He was barely keeping himself together, drinking too much, sleeping too little, haunted by memories that grew sharper with each passing day. What could he possibly offer a dying child except another disappointment, another abandonment? But when he opened his eyes and saw Nathan watching him with those grave, knowing eyes, eyes that had seen too much for someone so young, he found himself nodding. 3 days, he said hoarsely, but I'm not promising anything beyond that. Nathan's face brightened with something that might have been relief, though he tried to hide it. Thank you, sir. I won't be any trouble. Gabriel clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You're doing the right thing. Am I? Ethan looked down at the broken glass at his feet, the whiskey stain spreading across the weathered boards. I don't even know how to take care of myself anymore, Gabriel. What makes you think I can take care of him? The Reverend followed his gaze to the shattered bottle, understanding passing between them. Maybe that's exactly why you need each other. As Gabriel climbed back into his wagon and drove away, Ethan found himself alone with Nathan on the porch. The boy stood perfectly still, his small hands clasped behind his back, waiting for instructions. He looked so small, standing there so fragile, that Ethan felt a surge of panic at what he'd just agreed to. Well, he said awkwardly, I suppose you'll need somewhere to sleep. Nathan nodded. I don't take up much room, sir. A corner somewhere would be fine. Ethan, he corrected automatically. My name is Ethan, and you'll have a proper bed, not a corner. He led the boy into the house, acutely aware of how it must look through a child's eyes. Dust covered every surface, dishes sat unwashed in the kitchen sink, and the curtains hung limp and gray with neglect. The parlor, once Sarah's pride and joy, stood like a museum, to better times furniture covered with sheets photographs turned face down on the mantelpiece. Nathan took it all in without comment, his expression neutral. If he was shocked by the state of the place, he hid it well. Are you hungry? Ethan asked suddenly, realizing he had no idea what to feed a child. His own meals had been reduced to whatever required the least effort, hardtack and jerky mostly washed down with coffee or whiskey, depending on the time of day. A little, sir. Ethan, I mean. Nathan's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying his polite understatement. Ethan opened the pantry and stared at its meager contents. Some canned peaches, a loaf of bread that was only slightly stale, a few strips of dried meat. Not exactly a feast, but it would have to do. As he prepared a simple meal, he found himself stealing glances at the boy. Nathan had settled onto a kitchen chair, sitting perfectly straight with his hands folded in his lap. There was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he seemed to disappear into himself. It reminded Ethan uncomfortably of soldiers he'd treated during the war, men who had learned to endure pain by simply removing themselves from their bodies. Nathan, he said carefully, setting a plate of bread and peaches in front of the boy. Are you in pain right now? The child considered the question with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. Some, he admitted finally. It's not so bad during the day. Nights are harder. Ethan nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. Joseph had been the same way, brave during daylight hours, only allowing his suffering to show when darkness fell, and he thought no one was watching. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the clink of utensils and the distant whistle of wind through the eaves. Nathan ate slowly but steadily, cleaning his plate with the thoroughness of someone who had learned not to waste food. Thank you, he said when he finished. That was very good. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. The boy's politeness was clearly ingrained, a survival mechanism that had served him well in a world that seemed determined to reject him. Nathan, he said carefully. What happened to your parents? Gabriel mentioned your father brought you to the church. The boy's expression didn't change, but something shuddered behind his eyes. My mother died when I was 5. Fever took her. Pa tried to take care of me after that, but when I got sick, he said he couldn't manage anymore. Said it wasn't fair to my little sister to have sickness in the house. The matter-of-fact way Nathan recounted his abandonment made Ethan's chest tighten with anger. What kind of man turned his back on his own child when that child needed him most? The boy was clearly intelligent, well-mannered, and despite his illness still capable of contributing to a household. Yet his father had discarded him like a broken tool. I'm sorry, Ethan said the words, feeling inadequate. Nathan shrugged a gesture that tried to convey indifference but fell short. Reverend Wilson says God has a plan for everyone. Maybe this is mine. The simple faith in the boy's voice made something twist in Ethan's chest. After everything he'd been through, abandonment, illness, uncertainty about his future, Nathan still believed in divine purpose. It was either admirable or heartbreaking, and Ethan couldn't decide which. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan found himself at a loss for what to do with his unexpected guest. Nathan sat quietly in the parlor, his hands folded, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to having no control over his circumstances. Would you like to see the rest of the house? Ethan asked finally. Nathan nodded eagerly, the first real enthusiasm he'd shown since arriving. Ethan led him through the downstairs rooms, acutely aware of the dust and neglect. When they reached the music room, Nathan stopped short. A piano sat in the corner. Its lid closed, its surface covered with the same fine layer of dust that coated everything else. Sheet music lay scattered on the bench and floor, Mozart, Chopin, and several handwritten pieces that Sarah had composed in the early years of their marriage. Do you play? Nathan asked, his voice hushed with something like reverence. Ethan's throat tightened. My wife did, and my son was learning. He moved to close the door, but Nathan's next words stopped him. I can read music. My mother taught me before she died. We had an old piano in our parlor, not as nice as this one, but it made beautiful sounds when you touched the keys just right. Despite himself, Ethan found his hand moving to the piano lid. He lifted it slowly, revealing the ivory keys that hadn't been touched in 2 years. A few notes were stuck, and the whole instrument would need tuning, but it was still a fine piece, a wedding gift from Sarah's parents, that had brought countless hours of joy to their family. Nathan approached the bench with careful reverence, his small fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. "May I?" Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. The boy pressed a single key, middle C, and the note rang out clear and true in the dusty silence, then another and another, until he was picking out a simple melody that Ethan didn't recognize but found oddly soothing. "My mother used to play this for me when I couldn't sleep." Nathan explained, his fingers moving with surprising skill across the keys. "She said music was the language the heart speaks when words aren't enough." The melody was simple but haunting, filled with a melancholy that seemed to echo the boy's experiences. As he played, something in Nathan's posture relaxed, as if the music was allowing him to be fully himself for the first time since arriving. Ethan found himself remembering Sarah at this same piano, her dark hair falling across her face as she lost herself in Chopin's nocturnes, and Joseph struggling through his scales with the determined concentration of a child who wanted desperately to please his parents. The memory should have been painful, but somehow filtered through Nathan's gentle interpretation. It felt like a gift rather than a wound. When the boy finished, the silence that followed seemed different, softer somehow, as if the music had smoothed away some of the house's sharp edges. "That was beautiful," Ethan said quietly. Nathan ducked his head shy in the face of praise. "I'm out of practice, and I can't reach all the keys properly." "You'll grow into them," Ethan said automatically, then realized what he'd implied. Nathan would never grow into anything. The tumor growing on his back would see to that. The boy seemed to understand his mistake, but chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, he carefully closed the piano lid and stood up from the bench. "Should I help you with supper?" he asked, as if the moment of music had never happened. Ethan nodded, grateful for the boy's grace in letting him off the hook. As they made their way back to the kitchen, he found himself wondering what other hidden depths Nathan might reveal in the days to come. Supper was another simple affair, beans and cornbread with a bit of salt pork for flavor. Nathan ate with the same careful thoroughness as before, but Ethan noticed him wincing slightly when he reached for his water glass. The movement pulled at his back where the tumor was growing like a malevolent seed. "We should probably get you settled for the night," Ethan said when they finished eating. "There's a room upstairs that should suit you." He led Nathan up the narrow staircase, past the closed door of the master bedroom, where he and Sarah had once slept, past the smaller room that had been Joseph's. At the end of the hall was a guest room that had rarely been used, clean but spare, with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the prairie. "This should be comfortable enough," Ethan said, setting Nathan's small bundle of belongings on the bed. Nathan looked around the room with something approaching wonder. "It's very nice. Thank you." Ethan realized the boy was probably used to sleeping in church pews or charity house dormitories. A private room with a real bed was likely a luxury he hadn't experienced in months. "The washstand has fresh water," Ethan said awkwardly, "and there's a chamber pot under the bed if you need it during the night. If you get hungry or if the pain gets too bad, my room is just down the hall." Nathan nodded solemnly. "I'll try not to disturb you." Something in the boy's tone suggested he was accustomed to suffering in silence, to bearing whatever came without complaint or calls for help. It made Ethan's chest ache in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. "Nathan," he said carefully, "I want you to understand something. If you need help for any reason, you come get me. That's not a request, it's an order. Do you understand?" The boy's eyes widened slightly, as if kindness was still a foreign concept. "Yes, sir. Ethan, I mean." "Good." Ethan moved toward the door, then paused. "Sweet dreams." It was something he used to say to Joseph every night, an automatic blessing that had slipped out before he could stop it. Nathan's face lit up with a smile so genuine and grateful that it took Ethan's breath away. "Sweet dreams to you too, Ethan." Downstairs, Ethan poured himself a generous measure of whiskey and settled into his chair by the cold fireplace. The house felt different, with another presence in it, less tomb-like somehow, though he couldn't say exactly why. He thought about the boy upstairs, probably lying awake in a strange bed, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate the tumor on his back. Nathan had been nothing but polite and grateful, asking for nothing, expecting little, yet his very presence had stirred up emotions Ethan had thought safely buried. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it didn't dull the sharp edges of memory the way it usually did. Instead, he found himself thinking about the music Nathan had played, about the boy's quiet dignity in the face of abandonment and illness, about the way hope seemed to flicker in his eyes despite everything he'd been through. 3 days, Ethan reminded himself. He'd agreed to 3 days, nothing more. Surely he could maintain his emotional distance for that long. Surely he could resist the pull of those grave, knowing eyes and that fragile courage. But even as he told himself these things, he suspected he was lying. Upstairs, Nathan lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house settling around him. The mattress was softer than anything he'd slept on in months, and the sheets smelled like sunshine and lavender soap. He touched the spot on his back where the tumor pressed against his spine, feeling its familiar weight. Dr. Henderson had told Reverend Wilson it was growing faster now, spreading its poisonous influence through his young body like ink through water. Nathan understood what that meant, even if the adults around him tried to speak in euphemisms and half-truths. He was dying. Had been dying for months now, really, though he'd only recently learned to name it. The knowledge should have terrified him, but somehow it didn't. Death seemed like a distant country he would visit eventually, not an immediate threat. What scared him more was the thought of being alone when it came of facing that final journey without anyone who cared enough to grieve his passing. But here in this dusty house with the sad-eyed man who smelled like whiskey and sorrow, Nathan felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the possibility of belonging, even if only temporarily. Ethan had been kind to him, awkward and reluctant, but kind nonetheless. He'd given him food and shelter and hadn't looked at him with the mixture of pity and revulsion that had become so familiar. More importantly, he'd listened when Nathan played the piano, had heard the music, rather than just the noise of a sick child seeking attention. Nathan had learned to read adults well during his short, difficult life. He could see the pain that Ethan carried, the way grief had hollowed him out and left him fragile as an eggshell. The man was broken in ways that Nathan recognized, haunted by losses that mirrored his own. Perhaps that was why Reverend Wilson had brought him here. Not just because Nathan needed a place to die, but because two wounded souls might find comfort in each other's company. The boy smiled into the darkness, feeling more hopeful than he had in months. 3 days might not seem like much to most people, but Nathan had learned to measure his life in smaller increments. 3 days was enough time to make a difference, to plant seeds of healing that might grow long after he was gone. With that thought warming him like a blanket, Nathan finally drifted off to sleep, his small hand pressed against the spot where his mother's lullaby still echoed in his memory. In the morning, everything would change. Ethan woke to the sound of something he hadn't heard in 2 years, movement in his kitchen before dawn. For a disorienting moment, he thought Sarah had returned from the grave to prepare breakfast, as she always had, humming softly while the coffee percolated and bacon sizzled in the cast-iron pan. But as consciousness fully claimed him, the whiskey fog cleared enough to remind him of yesterday's unexpected arrival. Nathan. He pulled on his clothes and padded downstairs, following the gentle sounds of careful activity. What he found in his kitchen stopped him cold in the doorway. The boy stood on a wooden crate he'd apparently dragged in from the back porch, reaching up to the high shelves where Ethan kept his dishes. The table was already set for two, with mismatched plates and cups arranged with precise care. Coffee bubbled in the pot on the stove, filling the air with its rich aroma. "Good morning," Nathan said without turning around, as if he'd sensed Ethan's presence. "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep and I thought maybe I could help." Ethan rubbed his eyes, still not quite believing what he was seeing. "Nathan, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to," the boy interrupted gently, climbing down from the crate with careful movements that favored his left side. "But I want to. My mother always said idle hands make for restless minds, and mine gets pretty restless in the early hours." There was something in the way Nathan moved, a deliberate economy of motion that spoke of someone who had learned to conserve energy for what mattered most. Yet despite the obvious discomfort he was in, he'd taken it upon himself to bring order to Ethan's neglected kitchen. "How long have you been awake?" Ethan asked, noticing that not only had Nathan prepared breakfast, but he'd also washed the accumulation of dirty dishes that had been piling up in the sink. Nathan shrugged, pouring coffee into both cups, with hands that were steadier than Ethan's had been in months. I don't sleep much anymore. The pain makes it hard to find a comfortable position, and when I do fall asleep, I have strange dreams. What kind of dreams? The boy hesitated, as if debating whether to share something so personal. I dream about this place sometimes, about a boy who used to live here who had dark hair like mine and played piano better than I ever could. He shows me things where his father keeps the good coffee beans, which step on the back porch, creaks the loudest how to work the pump handle so it doesn't stick. Ethan's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down too quickly. You dream about Joseph. Is that his name? Nathan's eyes were curious rather than frightened. He never tells me. He just shows me things like he wants me to know how to take care of this place properly. The rational part of Ethan's mind insisted that Nathan must have overheard conversations in town about his family, must have pieced together details about Joseph from gossip and speculation. But the boy's matter-of-fact description of his dreams sent chills down Ethan's spine. Joseph had indeed discovered which coffee beans his father preferred, had learned to avoid the creaky porch step when he snuck out to watch the sunrise, had spent countless hours figuring out the quirks of their temperamental water pump. You must think I'm touched in the head, Nathan said quietly, misreading Ethan's silence. No, Ethan said, surprised to find he meant it. No, I don't think that at all. They ate breakfast in companionable, quiet eggs and bacon that Nathan had somehow managed to prepare perfectly, despite his obvious inexperience with Ethan's ancient cast-iron cookware. The boy ate slowly, pausing occasionally when a particular movement sent pain shooting through his back, but he never complained. Nathan, Ethan said carefully, have you ever been examined by a doctor? I mean, properly examined, not just looked at. The boy's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Dr. Henderson in town felt around. Some said it was definitely a tumor and that there wasn't much to be done about it. Before that, there was a doctor in Topeka who said the same thing. But no one's actually opened you up to see exactly what we're dealing with. Nathan shook his head. Pa said there was no point in putting me through surgery if it wouldn't change anything, said it would just be throwing good money after bad. The casual cruelty of the statement made Ethan's jaw clench. He'd known men like Nathan's father during the war, soldiers who would abandon wounded comrades if they slowed down the retreat, who calculated the worth of human life in terms of convenience and cost. Would you let me examine you? Ethan asked. I'm a surgeon, was a surgeon. I might be able to tell you more about what you're dealing with. Fear flickered across Nathan's features, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough to escape Ethan's notice. Would it hurt? I'd be as gentle as I could, and if I found something that could be helped. Ethan stopped himself before he could make promises he might not be able to keep. Well, let's just see what we're dealing with first. Nathan considered this for a long moment, his young face serious with the weight of adult decisions. All right, he said finally. If you think it might help. After breakfast, Ethan cleared his old examination table in what had once been his office. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. He found his medical bag, surprised that his hands remained steady as he laid out the instruments he hadn't touched since Joseph's final days. Nathan stood by the window, his small frame silhouetted against the prairie landscape. Dr. Ethan, he said softly, if you find out it's as bad as the others said, will you still let me stay the full 3 days? The question hit Ethan like a physical blow. This child, facing his own mortality with more courage than most adults could muster, was worried not about pain or death, but about being turned away before his temporary refuge expired. Nathan, Ethan said firmly, regardless of what I find, you have a place here for as long as you need it. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank you. The examination was heartbreaking in its thoroughness. Nathan submitted to Ethan's gentle probing with stoic courage, his only signs of discomfort, the way his small hands gripped the edge of the table, and the rapid breathing that betrayed his fear. The tumor was exactly where Nathan had indicated, a hard mass between his left shoulder blade and spine, roughly the size of a man's fist and growing steadily larger. But what made Ethan's breath catch wasn't the tumor itself, it was what surrounded it. The growth was encapsulated, contained within its own membrane like a malignant pearl. More importantly, it hadn't yet invaded the surrounding muscle tissue or attached itself to the spine. It was large and dangerous, but it was also operable. Nathan, Ethan said carefully, helping the boy back into his shirt. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. The boy nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. What if I told you there might be a way to remove this thing? It would be dangerous, surgery always is, and there are no guarantees. But there's a real chance that we could cut it out before it spreads any further. Nathan stared at him for a long moment, as if the words were in a foreign language he was struggling to translate. Do you mean you might not have to die? Ethan said simply. The boy's face crumpled, and for the first time since arriving, he looked every bit the frightened child he was. Tears streamed down his cheeks as the carefully constructed walls of acceptance and resignation came tumbling down. I don't want to die. He whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. I've been trying so hard to be brave, to not be afraid, but I don't want to die. Ethan gathered the sobbing child into his arms, feeling Nathan's thin frame shake with the force of emotions he'd been holding back for months. It was like holding Joseph again, feeling that same desperate vulnerability and fierce desire to live. We're going to try, Ethan promised, his own voice thick with emotion. I can't promise it will work, but we're going to try everything we can. Nathan cried for several minutes, releasing months of suppressed terror and grief. When the storm finally passed, he pulled back and wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. What would the surgery involve? He asked, and Ethan marveled at the boy's ability to regain his composure so quickly. I'd need to make an incision along your back and carefully remove the tumor without damaging the surrounding tissue. The biggest risk would be bleeding if I nick an artery or if the tumor has grown into one of the major blood vessels. There's also the risk of infection afterward. Nathan nodded gravely. And if you don't try? Then Dr. Henderson was right. The tumor will continue to grow until it either damages your spine or spreads to other parts of your body. How long would I have without the surgery? Ethan hesitated, then decided the boy deserved honesty. Maybe 3 months. Maybe 6 if you're lucky. Probably not longer than that. Nathan was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the endless prairie. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and determined. I'd like to try the surgery. Even if it doesn't work, at least I'll know I fought for my life instead of just giving up. The courage in that simple statement took Ethan's breath away. Here was a child who had been abandoned by his own father, shuffled from place to place like unwanted baggage, yet he still possessed the will to fight for his future. There's something else we need to consider, Ethan said carefully. I haven't performed surgery in 2 years. My hands... He held up his trembling fingers. They're not as steady as they once were. Nathan reached out and gently took Ethan's hands in his own small ones. They seem steady enough to me. And you examined me just now without hurting me at all. It was true. During the examination, Ethan's hands had been rock steady, guided by instinct and training that ran deeper than conscious thought. Perhaps having a purpose again, a life to fight for, was exactly what he needed to rediscover his skills. All right, Ethan said, making the decision that would change both their lives. But we'll need help. I can't do this alone. Reverend Wilson would help, Nathan suggested, and maybe Dr. Henderson. Even if he can't do the surgery himself, he might be able to assist. Ethan nodded already, planning what would need to be done. They'd have to sterilize his instruments, prepare proper surgical conditions, gather the medications they'd need for the operation and recovery. It would take time, perhaps a week or more, to make all the necessary preparations. Nathan, he said seriously, I want you to understand that this is your decision. No one else can make it for you. If you change your mind at any point, that's perfectly all right. The boy's chin lifted with quiet determination. I won't change my mind. For the first time since I got sick, someone is offering me hope instead of just sympathy. I'm not going to waste that gift. The afternoon was spent in a flurry of activity as they began planning for the surgery. Nathan insisted on helping with whatever tasks he could manage, and Ethan found himself grateful for the company. Having someone to talk through the procedure with, even someone so young, helped him organize his thoughts and remember details he might otherwise have overlooked. As they worked, Nathan told him more about his life before the illness. His mother had been a schoolteacher, the daughter of a circuit preacher who had married Nathan's father against her family's wishes. She'd taught Nathan to read and write, to play piano, to see beauty in small things even when life was difficult. She used to say that God gives everyone a special gift, Nathan said as he carefully sorted surgical instruments by size. She said the trick was figuring out what your gift was and then using it to help other people. What do you think your gift is? Ethan asked. Nathan considered this seriously. I think maybe it's seeing hope where other people see endings. Like with you, everyone in town says you're a lost cause, that grief has ruined you completely. But I can see the doctor you used to be still there underneath all the sadness. The observation was so perceptive, so gentle in its honesty, that Ethan had to look away. This child saw past his drunken despair to the man he'd once been, the healer who had saved countless lives before losing the only one that truly mattered to him. And maybe, Nathan continued quietly, my gift is giving you a reason to be that man again. That evening, as they sat down to another simple meal, Ethan found himself studying the boy across from him. Nathan ate with good appetite despite the pain he was clearly in, and he'd insisted on setting the table with the same careful attention to detail he'd shown that morning. Tell me about Joseph, Nathan said suddenly, looking up from his plate. Ethan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. In 2 years, no one had asked him that question directly. People had offered condolences, had spoken in general terms about loss and healing, but no one had simply asked him to share memories of his son. He was everything good about his mother and me, Ethan said slowly. Smart like Sarah, stubborn like me. He had this laugh that could fill up a whole room, and he was always getting into some kind of mischief. Sarah used to say he was too curious for his own good. Nathan listened with the intense attention of someone hungry for stories of a normal childhood, a life lived without the shadow of illness hanging over it. He loved music. Ethan continued, finding it easier to talk about Joseph than he'd expected. Sarah started teaching him piano when he was 5, and he took to it like he'd been born knowing how. By the time he was 7, he was composing his own little melodies. Is that what was scattered around the piano bench, his compositions? Ethan nodded. He was working on something special before he got sick, a song for his mother's birthday. He never got to finish it. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Nathan spoke up again. Do you think he would have minded me being here? The question caught Ethan off guard. Why would he mind? Because I'm sick like he was, because I'm sleeping in his house, eating at his table. Nathan's voice grew smaller. Because I'm going to get the chance to fight that he never had. Ethan set down his fork and looked directly into Nathan's worried eyes. Nathan listened to me very carefully. Joseph was the kindest, most generous soul I've ever known. If he could see us right now, he'd be happy that his home was sheltering someone who needed it. He'd be proud that his father was using his skills to help instead of just drowning in whiskey and self-pity. Nathan's eyes brightened with something that might have been relief. You really think so? I know so. And I think... Ethan paused, struggling with emotions he'd kept buried for 2 years. I think he'd like you very much. You have the same kind of courage. He did the same way of finding light in dark places. That night, as Ethan prepared for bed, he heard the soft sound of piano music drifting up from downstairs. Nathan was playing again. Not his mother's lullaby this time, but something else, something that sounded almost familiar. Curious? Ethan crept downstairs and peered into the music room. Nathan sat at the piano bench, his small fingers picking out a melody that Ethan recognized with a shock of recognition. It was Joseph's unfinished birthday song for Sarah, the composition his son had been working on when the illness took hold. But Nathan wasn't just playing what Joseph had written, he was continuing it, adding new passages that seemed to flow naturally from the original melody. The music was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a bittersweet longing that spoke of love and loss and hope all intertwined. Ethan found himself transfixed, watching this strange, brave child give voice to his dead son's unfinished dreams. When Nathan finally stopped playing, the silence seemed to echo with the ghosts of all the music that had once filled this house. It's beautiful, Ethan said softly, stepping into the room. Nathan startled, then relaxed when he saw who it was. I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep and the melody kept running through my head. It felt like it wanted to be finished. How did you know how it was supposed to go? Nathan's expression grew thoughtful. I'm not sure I did know exactly. But when I sat down to play it, the notes just seemed to suggest where they wanted to go next, like the song was already complete somewhere and I was just discovering it. Ethan sat down on the couch where he'd so often listened to Sarah and Joseph practice together. Would you play it again?" Nathan's face lit up with pleasure. Of course. This time Ethan closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. The melody Joseph had started was simple and sweet, the musical equivalent of a child's unconditional love. But Nathan's additions gave it depth and complexity, transforming it into something that spoke of mature understanding of life's joys and sorrows. When the last notes faded away, Ethan felt as if he'd been given a gift beyond price, the chance to hear his son's final creation brought to its intended completion. "Thank you," he said simply. Nathan smiled, closing the piano lid with the same reverence he'd shown the night before. "It feels right having music in this house again, like it was meant to be here." As they made their way upstairs, Ethan found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken in just 2 days. A dying child had arrived on his doorstep, and somehow that child was bringing his house back to life, note by note, meal by meal, act of simple kindness by act of simple kindness. "Ethan." Nathan's voice was soft in the darkened hallway. "Yes. Thank you for giving me hope. Even if the surgery doesn't work, thank you for making me feel like my life is worth fighting for." Ethan's throat tightened with emotion. "Your life is worth fighting for, Nathan. Never doubt that." As he lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around them, Ethan realized that something fundamental had shifted in his world. For the first time in 2 years, he had a reason to get up in the morning that didn't involve reaching for a bottle. He had a purpose again, a life depending on his skills and his strength. The boy sleeping down the hall was dying, might still die despite everything they were going to attempt, but he was also vibrantly, courageously alive, facing each day with a grace that shamed Ethan's own surrender to despair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began the serious preparations for Nathan's surgery. There would be difficult conversations with Gabriel and Dr. Henderson, careful planning and preparation, and the ever-present knowledge that they were racing against time. But tonight, for the first time in years, Ethan fell asleep to the memory of music in his house and the sound of someone else breathing in the room down the hall. It was the beginning of healing, not just for Nathan, but for the broken man who had agreed to shelter him. The next morning brought Dr. Samuel Fletcher to Ethan's door, his medical bag clutched in hands that trembled not from age, but from the weight of what he'd been asked to consider. The young physician had been Ethan's most promising student before the war, before grief had driven his mentor into exile. Now, standing on the weathered porch where he'd once come as an eager apprentice, Samuel looked like a man wrestling with impossible choices. "Ethan," he said by way of greeting, his voice carefully neutral, "Gabriel told me about the boy." Through the kitchen window, they could see Nathan at the stove, moving with the careful efficiency that had become his hallmark. He was preparing lunch with the same attention to detail he brought to everything, his small frame silhouetted against the afternoon light streaming through glass that sparkled from his morning cleaning. "He also told me about your proposal," Samuel continued, setting his bag down with deliberate care. "I have to say, Ethan, I think you've lost your mind." Ethan had been expecting this reaction. Samuel Fletcher was a good doctor, but a cautious one, trained in the careful protocols of established medicine. The idea of attempting major surgery in a farmhouse kitchen, performed by a man who hadn't held a scalpel in 2 years, would naturally horrify him. "Have I," Ethan asked mildly, "or have I finally found it again?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "You're talking about operating on a child with a tumor that's already been deemed inoperable by 2 qualified physicians. You're talking about doing it here in conditions that would make a battlefield surgeon cringe. And you're talking about doing it with hands that—" He gestured helplessly at Ethan's fingers, which were indeed showing their characteristic tremor. "My hands are fine when they need to be," Ethan said quietly. "They were steady enough when I examined Nathan yesterday. They'll be steady enough when it matters." From the kitchen came the sound of Nathan humming softly to himself as he worked. It was a fragment of the melody he'd completed the night before Joseph's song, made whole by a dying child's intuitive understanding of what the music needed to become. Samuel's expression softened slightly at the sound. "Ethan, I know what this boy means to you. I can see it in your face, hear it in your voice. He reminds you of Joseph, doesn't he?" "Yes," Ethan admitted. But this isn't about replacing my son or trying to undo the past. This is about a child who deserves a chance to live, and I might be the only person willing to give him that chance. And if you're wrong, if your hands fail you at a critical moment, if the tumor is more extensive than you think. Samuel's voice grew heated. That boy could die on your kitchen table, Ethan. He could die in agony and his blood would be on your hands. The words hit their target, awakening the guilt and self-doubt that had been Ethan's constant companion since Joseph's death. But before he could respond, Nathan's voice came from the doorway behind them. "Dr. Fletcher," the boy said politely, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you for coming to discuss my surgery." Samuel turned, and Ethan saw his expression shift as he took in Nathan's appearance. The boy was thin and pale, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant pain. But there was also something luminous about him, a quality of inner strength that seemed to shine through his fragile exterior. "Hello, Nathan," Samuel said gently, his professional manner automatically engaging. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than yesterday," Nathan replied with a small smile. "Dr. Ethan says you might be able to help with the surgery. I hope you'll consider it." Samuel glanced between Nathan and Ethan, clearly struggling with conflicting emotions. "Nathan, do you understand what we're talking about? The risks involved?" The boy nodded seriously. "Dr. Ethan explained everything to me. He said there's no guarantee the surgery will work and that I might die on the table. But he also said that without it, I'll definitely die in a few months. Those seem like pretty easy odds to calculate." The matter-of-fact way Nathan discussed his own mortality made Samuel flinch. This child had been forced to confront death with a composure that most adults never achieved, and there was something both heartbreaking and inspiring about his acceptance of the situation. "May I examine you?" Samuel asked quietly. Nathan nodded and led both doctors into Ethan's office, where he submitted to another thorough examination with the patient dignity that had become his trademark. Samuel's hands were gentle but thorough as he palpated the tumor, his expression growing increasingly grave as he discovered what Ethan had found the day before. When the examination was complete, Samuel stepped back with a thoughtful frown. "It's encapsulated," he said as much to himself as to the others. "That's what I thought," Ethan confirmed. "It hasn't invaded the surrounding tissue yet, and it doesn't seem to be attached to the spine. If we can get to it before it spreads." "It would still be an incredibly delicate operation," Samuel warned. "One slip, one moment of uncertainty, and we could sever an artery or damage the spinal cord." Nathan pulled his shirt back on with careful movements, then looked directly at Samuel. "Dr. Fletcher, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "If this was your son lying on that table, and Dr. Ethan was offering you the only chance to save his life, would you take it?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Samuel's face went through a series of emotions, surprise, pain, and finally a reluctant understanding. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "No," Nathan agreed. "It's not. Nothing about this situation is fair, but that doesn't change the fact that it's my life we're talking about, and I'm asking you to help save it." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What would you need from me?" Ethan felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. An extra pair of hands during the operation. Someone to monitor Nathan's vital signs to help control bleeding if we run into complications. And someone to help with the recovery afterward. "The recovery could take weeks," Samuel warned. "If he survives the surgery, he'll need constant care, careful monitoring for signs of infection or other complications." "I'll be here," Ethan said simply. "For as long as it takes." Samuel nodded slowly, accepting the weight of the commitment they were all making. "When do you want to do this?" "We need time to prepare properly," Ethan said. "Clean and sterilize the instruments, set up proper surgical conditions, gather the medications we'll need. I'd say a week from today if Nathan's condition doesn't deteriorate before then." Nathan, who had been listening to this exchange with intense concentration, suddenly swayed on his feet. Both doctors moved to steady him, but he waved them off with a wan smile. "I'm all right," he said, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "The excitement is just catching up with me, I think." Samuel's trained eye cataloged the subtle signs of the boy's declining condition. The slight shortness of breath, the way he unconsciously favored his left side, the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Nathan," he said gently, "I want you to promise me something. If you start feeling worse, if the pain increases significantly, or if you develop any new symptoms, you need to tell us immediately. We can't help you if we don't know what's happening." The boy nodded solemnly. "I promise. I want this surgery to work too much to hide anything that might prevent it." After Samuel left with a promise to return the following day to begin preparations, Ethan found himself alone with Nathan in the quiet kitchen. The boy was sitting at the table, his small hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. "Are you having second thoughts?" Ethan asked, settling into the chair across from him. Nathan looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "No, but I'm scared." It was the first time he'd admitted to fear so directly, and the simple honesty of it touched something deep in Ethan's chest. "So am I," Ethan confessed. "I'm terrified that I'll fail you, that my hands won't be steady enough when it matters most." "But you're going to try anyway." "Yes, because the alternative is watching you die slowly, and I can't do that. Not again." Nathan reached across the table and placed his small hand over Ethan's larger one. "Dr. Ethan, can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone else." Ethan nodded, sensing that whatever Nathan was about to share would be significant. "I'm not afraid of dying," the boy said quietly. "I've been living with that possibility for so long that it doesn't scare me anymore. What scares me is dying without having really lived, without having made a difference in someone's life, without having left something beautiful behind." The words were spoken with such simple wisdom that Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. This child, facing his own mortality with such grace, was worried not about his own suffering, but about the mark he would leave on the world. "Nathan," Ethan said carefully, "you've already made a difference. You've given me a reason to care again, to use my skills for something meaningful. You've brought music back into this house, and joy and hope. Whatever happens with the surgery, you've already left something beautiful behind." Nathan's eyes brightened with tears, but his smile was radiant. "Thank you for saying that, and thank you for giving me the chance to fight." The rest of the day was spent in quiet preparation and companionship. Nathan insisted on helping with whatever tasks he could manage, and Ethan found himself grateful for the boy's steady presence. They sorted through medical supplies, organized instruments, and planned the logistics of converting the dining room into a temporary operating theater. As evening approached, Nathan sat down at the piano again. This time, instead of playing Joseph's completed song, he worked on something new, a melody that seemed to emerge from his fingertips like water from a spring. "What is that?" Ethan asked, drawn by the haunting beauty of the music. "I'm not sure yet," Nathan replied, his fingers continuing to explore the keys. "It feels like a song about hope, about taking chances even when you're scared, maybe about two people helping each other find their way back to the light." The melody was complex and layered with themes that wove in and out of each other like voices in conversation. Ethan recognized fragments of Joseph's birthday song woven into the new composition, as if Nathan was creating a musical dialogue between past and present. "It's beautiful," Ethan said softly. "It's not finished yet," Nathan replied. "I keep thinking there should be more to it, something that brings all the pieces together, but I can't quite hear what it's supposed to be." "Maybe you'll find it," Ethan suggested. "Sometimes the best music comes when you're not trying so hard to force it." Nathan nodded, continuing to play softly as the last light of day faded from the windows. The music filled the house with warmth and life, banishing the shadows that had haunted these rooms for too long. That night, as they prepared for bed, Nathan paused at the foot of the stairs. "Dr. Ethan," he said quietly, "whatever happens with the surgery, I want you to know that these have been the happiest days I've had since my mother died. You've made me feel like I belong somewhere again." The simple statement hit Ethan with unexpected force. This child, who had been abandoned by his own father and shuffled from place to place like unwanted cargo, had found something precious in this broken-down farmhouse with its grief-stricken owner. "You do belong here," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion, "for as long as you want to stay." As the days leading up to the surgery passed, A strange kind of peace settled over the farmhouse. Ethan threw himself into preparations with an intensity he hadn't felt since his early days as a surgeon, meticulously planning every aspect of the operation. Nathan helped where he could, his quiet presence a constant source of calm in the midst of controlled chaos. Gabriel visited daily, bringing supplies and moral support. His faith in the rightness of what they were attempting never wavered, even when Ethan himself was plagued by doubts in the small hours of the night. "God brought that boy to you for a reason," the Reverend said one afternoon as they watched Nathan tend to the small garden he'd started behind the house. Despite his illness, the boy had insisted on planting seeds, wanting to leave something growing in the earth, even if he might not live to see the harvest. "And what reason is that?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "To heal you both," Gabriel replied simply. "He needs your skills to have a chance at life, and you need his courage to remember who you used to be." Samuel came every day as well, his initial reluctance gradually giving way to a quiet determination. He brought additional medical supplies from his practice in town and spent hours with Ethan reviewing surgical techniques they hadn't used in years. "Your hands are steadier than you think," Samuel observed one afternoon as they practiced suture techniques on pieces of leather. "Whatever demons you've been wrestling with, they don't seem to affect your medical skills." Ethan paused in his stitching, considering this observation. It was true, whenever he focused on medical tasks, the tremors that plagued him at other times seemed to disappear entirely. It was as if his body remembered its purpose, even when his mind struggled with doubt. The townspeople began to hear whispers of what was planned, and a steady stream of visitors started arriving at the farmhouse. Mrs. Henderson brought fresh bread and preserves. Tom Miller, the blacksmith, offered his wife services as a nurse if they were needed. Even stern-faced Judge Morrison stopped by to offer his prayers and support. "That boy's touched a lot of hearts in a short time," Gabriel observed one evening as they watched yet another neighbor depart after leaving food and good wishes. Nathan seemed genuinely surprised by the outpouring of concern from people he barely knew. He'd grown accustomed to being treated as a burden or an object of pity, and the genuine affection he was receiving from the community overwhelmed him. "Why are they being so kind to me?" he asked Ethan after the banker's wife had left a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden. "Because they see what I see," Ethan replied, "a brave, good-hearted boy who deserves every chance at happiness." 3 days before the surgery, Nathan's condition took a troubling turn. He woke in the middle of the night crying out in pain, his back spasming with such intensity that he couldn't catch his breath. Ethan found him curled in a ball on his bed, tears streaming down his face as he fought against agony that seemed to be tearing him apart from the inside. "It's getting bigger," Nathan gasped between waves of pain. "I can feel it pressing against my spine." Ethan's examination confirmed his worst fears. The tumor had grown significantly in just the past few days, and its expansion was putting increasing pressure on Nathan's spinal cord. If they waited much longer, the boy might be paralyzed before they ever got him to the operating table. "We need to move the surgery up," he told Samuel the next morning. "Tomorrow, if possible." Samuel's face paled. "Ethan, we're not ready. We haven't finished sterilizing all the instruments, and I haven't had time to review all the procedures. We're as ready as we're going to be," Ethan interrupted. "If we wait any longer, it may be too late." Samuel nodded grimly, understanding the implications. They spent the rest of the day in frantic preparation, working until well past midnight to ensure that everything would be ready for the morning operation. Nathan bore the news of the schedule change with characteristic grace, though Ethan could see the fear flickering behind his brave facade. "I guess it's better to get it over with," the boy said with forced cheerfulness. "The waiting is almost worse than the surgery will be." On the evening before the surgery, Nathan sat at the piano one final time. He played through his incomplete composition, the melody flowing from the keys like a prayer made audible. When he reached the end of what he'd written, he sat quietly for a moment, his hands resting on the keys. "I think I know what the ending should be," he said suddenly, his fingers beginning to move again. "It should be about hope fulfilled, about finding out that the scary thing you've been dreading might actually be the doorway to something wonderful." The new passage he played was different from what had come before, brighter, more triumphant, yet tinged with a bittersweet awareness that all beautiful things are temporary. When the last notes faded into silence, Ethan felt as if he'd witnessed something sacred. "That's perfect," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it needed." Nathan smiled, closing the piano lid with careful reverence. Now it's complete. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least I finished something beautiful. They ate a quiet supper together, neither speaking much but both drawing comfort from the simple ritual of sharing a meal. Nathan picked at his food, his appetite diminished by anxiety and the increasing pressure from the tumor, but he made an effort to eat enough to maintain his strength. As they prepared for bed, Nathan hesitated at his bedroom door. "Dr. Ethan," he said softly, "I know you're going to do everything you can to save me tomorrow, but if something goes wrong, if I don't wake up from the surgery, I want you to know that I'm not sorry we tried. I'd rather die fighting for my life than just give up and wait for the end." Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Nothing is going to go wrong," he said firmly. "I'm going to fix you, Nathan. I'm going to give you the chance to grow up and become the remarkable man I can already see you're going to be." Nathan's smile was radiant despite his fear. "I believe you. And even if you're wrong, I believe you'll try with everything you have." Later that night, as Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling, he could hear Nathan moving restlessly in the room down the hall. The boy was clearly struggling with pain and anxiety, but he never called out for help or complained about his discomfort. Finally, unable to bear the sound of the child suffering any longer, Ethan got up and padded down the hall to Nathan's room. He found the boy sitting up in bed, his arms wrapped around his knees, staring out the window at the star-filled sky. "Can't sleep?" Ethan asked softly. Nathan shook his head. "My back hurts worse tonight, and I keep thinking about tomorrow. I know I said I wasn't afraid of dying, but the truth is, I'm terrified of the pain. What if I'm not brave enough when it matters?" Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed, his heart aching for this child who was being forced to face fears that would daunt grown men. "Nathan," he said gently, "courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. You've already shown more courage in your short life than most people manage in decades." "But what if I cry during the surgery? What if I embarrass myself?" "There's no shame in crying when you're in pain," Ethan assured him, "and you'll be unconscious for most of the operation anyway. The chloroform will make sure you don't feel anything until it's over." Nathan nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Will you stay with me during the surgery? I mean, even if I can't see you or hear you, will you be there?" "I'll be right there the whole time," Ethan promised. "And when you wake up, I'll be the first face you see." Gradually, Nathan's restless energy began to calm. Ethan stayed with him until the boy finally drifted off to sleep, his breathing becoming deeper and more regular as exhaustion overcame anxiety. As dawn approached, Ethan made his way to the kitchen to prepare what might be Nathan's last meal in this house or anywhere else. The thought sent a chill through him, but he pushed it aside. Today was about hope, about the possibility of healing, about giving a brave child the chance he deserved. When Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway fully dressed and trying to hide his nervousness behind a bright smile, Ethan felt a surge of protective love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "Good morning," Nathan said cheerfully. "Are you ready to save my life?" Looking at this remarkable child, this boy who had brought light back into his darkest hour, Ethan discovered that he was indeed ready. His hands were steady, his mind was clear, and his heart was full of determination to give Nathan the future he deserved. "Yes," Ethan said simply, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "I'm ready." The dining room had been transformed overnight into something resembling a proper surgical theater. Samuel had arrived before dawn with additional supplies, and together they had arranged the long oak table where Sarah had once served holiday dinners. Clean white sheets covered every surface, and Ethan's surgical instruments lay gleaming in neat rows on a side table, each one meticulously sterilized and sharpened to a razor's edge. Gabriel stood quietly in the corner, his weathered hands clasped in prayer, while Mrs. Henderson, Samuel's wife, and the closest thing to a trained nurse they could manage, checked and rechecked their preparations with nervous efficiency. The morning sun streamed through windows that Nathan had insisted on cleaning one final time, casting everything in golden light that seemed almost ethereal. Nathan himself sat in the kitchen picking at a breakfast he couldn't quite manage to finish. His face was pale but composed, and he dressed in his cleanest shirt as if preparing for church rather than surgery that might save or end his life. "I keep thinking about my mother," he said quietly, pushing eggs around his plate with his fork. "She used to tell me that whenever you're facing something scary, you should imagine angels standing around you holding you safe." Ethan sat down across from him, noting the slight tremor in the boy's hands and the way he kept shifting position to ease the pressure on his back. The tumor had grown visibly larger in the past few days, creating a noticeable asymmetry in Nathan's slight frame. "Do you think she's watching today?" Ethan asked gently. Nathan's eyes brightened with tears he was trying hard not to shed. "I hope so. I hope she knows I tried to be brave like she taught me." "She knows," Ethan said with absolute certainty. "And she's proud of you." Samuel appeared in the doorway, his medical bag in hand and his expression carefully neutral. "Nathan, we're ready for you whenever you are." The boy nodded and stood up slowly, wincing as the movement sent pains shooting through his back. He'd been trying to hide how much worse the pain had become, but Ethan could see it in the careful way he moved the tight set of his shoulders, the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Dr. Ethan," Nathan said softly, "before we start, I need to ask you something." "Of course. If something goes wrong during the surgery, if I start to die on the table, I don't want you to blame yourself. This is my choice, and I'm grateful you're giving me the chance to make it." The simple wisdom in the boy's words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Here was a child not yet 10 years old facing the possibility of death with more grace and maturity than most adults ever achieved. "Nothing is going to go wrong," Ethan said firmly, though his own heart was racing with anxiety. "I'm going to fix you, and then you're going to have a long, happy life." Nathan smiled, the expression transforming his pale features with radiant hope. "I believe you." They made their way to the dining room in solemn procession. Nathan walking with careful dignity, Ethan and Samuel flanking him like honor guards, Gabriel and Mrs. Henderson following behind. The improvised operating theater seemed to hold its breath as they entered sunlight, dancing off the polished surgical instruments and creating patterns of light and shadow on the white sheets. Nathan climbed onto the table without assistance, lying face down with his arms folded beneath his forehead. Mrs. Henderson began the process of exposing the surgical site, her gentle hands careful not to cause unnecessary discomfort as she cut away the boy's shirt and positioned him properly. The tumor was even more frightening than Ethan had expected. What had begun as a hard mass the size of a walnut had grown to nearly twice that size, creating an angry red swelling that stretched the skin tight and threatened to burst through at any moment. He could see why the other doctors had deemed it inoperable. The growth seemed to have tentacles reaching deep into Nathan's back, and its proximity to the spine made any surgical approach fraught with danger. But Ethan had fought through worse conditions during the war, had performed miracles with nothing but field instruments and sheer determination. If Nathan was brave enough to trust him with his life, then he would prove worthy of that trust. "Samuel," he said quietly, "prepare the chloroform. Mrs. Henderson, I'll need you to monitor his breathing and pulse throughout the procedure." Samuel nodded and began soaking a clean cloth with the anesthetic. "Nathan, I'm going to place this mask over your nose and mouth. I want you to breathe normally and count backwards from 10. You'll be asleep before you reach 5. Nathan turned his head slightly to look at Ethan one final time. "Thank you for believing in me," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me something to believe in again." Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. The chloroform took effect quickly, Nathan's small body relaxing into unconsciousness as his breathing deepened and steadied. For a moment, the only sounds in the room were the soft whisper of his breath and the distant twitter of birds outside the window. Ethan stood over the table, scalpel in hand, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. One wrong move, one moment of uncertainty, and this brave child would die. But as he raised the blade and positioned it over Nathan's back, his hands were perfectly steady. "God guide your hands," Gabriel whispered from his corner. Ethan made the first incision with confidence, born of years of training and experience. The skin parted cleanly, revealing the layers of muscle and tissue beneath. Blood welled up immediately, but not more than expected, and Mrs. Henderson was ready with clean cloths to absorb it. "Good color," Samuel observed, monitoring Nathan's vital signs. "Pulse is strong and regular." Ethan worked with methodical precision, deepening the incision and carefully separating the muscle fibers to expose the tumor beneath. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. The growth was even larger than he'd anticipated, its malignant tendrils reaching deep into Nathan's back like the roots of some poisonous tree. But it was also exactly what he'd hoped to find. The tumor was still encapsulated within its own membrane, contained like a malevolent pearl within an oyster shell. More importantly, it hadn't attached itself to the spine or invaded the major blood vessels that ran alongside it. "It's operable," he announced, unable to keep the relief from his voice. "Difficult, but operable." The next hour passed in a blur of careful dissection and meticulous removal. Ethan worked with the patience of a craftsman, following the tumor's boundaries with surgical precision, separating healthy tissue from diseased with cuts so fine they barely bled. Samuel assisted with quiet efficiency, anticipating Ethan's needs and providing gentle suction to keep the surgical field clear. Mrs. Henderson maintained her vigil over Nathan's unconscious form, monitoring his breathing and pulse with the dedication of a mother watching over a sick child. Gabriel's whispered prayers provided a constant counterpoint to the soft sounds of surgery, his faith, a steadying presence in the room. The most dangerous moment came when Ethan reached the deepest part of the tumor, where it pressed against the delicate membrane surrounding Nathan's spinal cord. One slip here, one moment of carelessness, and the boy could be paralyzed for life, assuming he survived it all. "Steady." Samuel murmured more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan's hands moved with surgical precision, his scalpel tracing the tumor's boundaries with the delicacy of an artist's brush. Slowly, carefully, he began to separate the mass from the surrounding tissue, following the natural planes of dissection that would allow him to remove it intact. The tumor resisted at first, clinging to the boy's flesh with malignant determination. But gradually, inexorably, Ethan worked it free, his years of experience guiding him through the most treacherous passages. When the final connection was severed and the entire mass lifted free from Nathan's back, the silence in the room was profound. "Dear God," Samuel breathed, staring at the tumor that Ethan held in his hands. It was the size of a large orange, its surface mottled and angry, shot through with blood vessels that spoke of its rapid growth. How was that child even able to walk? Ethan set the tumor aside and examined the cavity it had left behind. Clean margins, minimal bleeding, no obvious damage to the surrounding structures. The surgery had been a complete success, at least the removal portion of it. "Now comes the hard part," he said grimly, beginning the painstaking process of closing the wound. Layer by layer, Ethan rebuilt what the tumor had destroyed. He sutured muscle back to muscle, reconnected severed blood vessels, and carefully repositioned the anatomical structures that had been displaced by the growth. Each stitch was placed with surgical precision, each knot tied with the perfect tension needed to promote healing without cutting off circulation. Nathan's vital signs remained stable throughout the procedure, his young body responding well to the trauma of surgery. His breathing stayed deep and regular, his pulse strong and steady, his color good despite the significant blood loss. As Ethan placed the final stitches in Nathan's skin, Samuel checked the boy's reflexes one more time. "Everything looks good," he reported. "No signs of nerve damage or spinal cord injury." Mrs. Henderson had already prepared clean bandages and had fresh linens ready to make Nathan comfortable during his recovery. Gabriel's prayers had grown more fervent as the surgery progressed, and now tears of gratitude streamed down his weathered cheeks. "How long before we know if it worked?" Mrs. Henderson asked, carefully cleaning the blood from Nathan's skin around the surgical site. "The next 24 hours will be critical," Ethan replied, finally allowing exhaustion to show in his voice. The surgery had taken nearly 3 hours, and the sustained concentration had left him drained. "If he makes it through tonight without complications, his chances will improve dramatically." They moved Nathan to the clean bed they'd prepared in the parlor, where they could monitor him more easily during his recovery. The boy looked impossibly small and fragile lying there, his back swathed in white bandages, his breathing still deep and regular from the lingering effects of the chloroform. Ethan settled into the chair beside the bed, unwilling to leave Nathan's side even for a moment. The surgery had been successful, but he knew from experience that the real battle was just beginning. Infection, bleeding, complications from the anesthesia, any number of things could still go wrong. "You should get some rest," Samuel suggested, noting the exhaustion in his mentor's face. "I can watch him for a while." Ethan shook his head. "I promised him I'd be here when he woke up. I'm not leaving this room until he opens his eyes." As the afternoon wore on, Nathan began to stir. Small movements at first, a twitch of his fingers, a slight change in his breathing pattern. Then his eyelids fluttered and he made a soft sound of confusion as consciousness slowly returned. "Nathan." Ethan leaned forward, taking the boy's hand in his own. "Can you hear me?" Nathan's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually clearing as he became aware of his surroundings. When he saw Ethan's face hovering over him, he managed a weak smile. "Did it work?" He whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube Samuel had used during surgery. "It worked," Ethan said, his own voice thick with emotion. "The tumor is gone, Nathan. All of it." Tears leaked from the corners of Nathan's eyes as the full meaning of those words sank in. "I'm going to live. You're going to live a long, healthy life," Ethan confirmed, squeezing the boy's hand gently. The surgery was a complete success. Nathan tried to sit up, then gasped as pain shot through his back. "Easy," Ethan cautioned. "You've been through major surgery. It's going to take time for your body to heal." "But I can feel my legs," Nathan said, wonderingly wiggling his toes beneath the blanket. "I was so afraid I'd wake up paralyzed." "Your spine is fine," Samuel assured him, checking Nathan's reflexes once more. Dr. Callaway's hands were steady as a rock throughout the entire procedure. Nathan turned his head to look at Ethan with eyes full of gratitude and wonder. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first," Ethan replied simply. "You gave me a reason to remember who I used to be." The next few days passed in a blur of careful monitoring and gradual recovery. Nathan's body responded well to the surgery, his incision healing cleanly without signs of infection. The constant pain that had plagued him for months was gone, replaced by the temporary discomfort of surgical healing that grew less each day. Gabriel visited daily, bringing news from town and updates on Nathan's garden, which several neighbors had volunteered to tend in his absence. Samuel came twice a day to check the boy's progress and change his bandages, marveling at how quickly Nathan was healing. "He's young," Samuel observed one afternoon as he examined the surgical site. "Young bodies have an amazing capacity for recovery. The incision is closing beautifully, and there's no sign of infection." Nathan himself proved to be a model patient, following Ethan's instructions with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else. He rested when told to rest, ate the nourishing meals Mrs. Henderson prepared for him, and endured the discomfort of bandage changes without complaint. On the third day after surgery, Nathan was finally allowed to sit up in bed for short periods. The first time he managed it without assistance, his face lit up with a joy so pure and radiant that everyone in the room found themselves smiling in response. "I can't remember the last time sitting up didn't hurt," he said, wonderingly, experimentally moving his shoulders without the familiar stab of pain. "It's like someone lifted a great weight off my back." "Someone did," Ethan said with satisfaction. "A tumor weighing nearly 2 pounds. No wonder you were in such constant pain." That evening, as Nathan grew stronger and more alert, he asked if he could try playing the piano again. Ethan was reluctant at first. The boy was still recovering from major surgery, but Nathan's pleading eyes eventually wore down his resistance. "Just for a few minutes," Ethan conceded, helping Nathan out of bed and supporting him as they made their way slowly to the music room. Nathan settled onto the piano bench, with visible relief, his fingers hovering over the keys with reverent anticipation. When he pressed the first note, a clear, sweet middle C, his face transformed with wonder. "It doesn't hurt," he breathed. "I can sit up straight and it doesn't hurt at all." He began to play the melody he'd completed just before the surgery, the piece that had seemed to capture both hope and uncertainty in its flowing passages. But now, with the tumor gone and his future stretching bright before him, the music took on new dimensions of joy and triumph. When he reached the ending, he'd composed that final night, the passage about hope fulfilled and scary doorways leading to wonderful things. His playing grew stronger and more confident. The notes seemed to dance from his fingers, filling the house with music that spoke of healing and second chances and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. As the last notes faded into silence, Nathan turned to Ethan with tears streaming down his face. "I really am going to live, aren't I? This isn't just a dream." "It's not a dream," Ethan assured him, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're going to live, Nathan. You're going to grow up and become everything you were meant to be." Nathan slid off the piano bench and threw his arms around Ethan's waist, hugging him with all the strength his recovering body could muster. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Ethan held the boy close, feeling his small frame trembling with emotion and gratitude. In saving Nathan's life, he had somehow managed to save his own as well, rediscovering purpose and hope in the simple act of healing. As they stood there in the music room where Joseph had once practiced his scales and Sarah had played her nocturnes, Ethan realized that the house was alive again in ways it hadn't been for years. The shadows seemed less deep, the silence less oppressive, the very air lighter and more breathable. "Nathan," he said quietly, "I have something to ask you." The boy pulled back to look at him, his young face serious with attention. "When you're fully recovered, when you're strong enough to travel, you're welcome to stay here for as long as you want. This can be your home if you'd like it to be." Nathan's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "You mean it? You'd want me to stay?" "I can't think of anything I'd want more," Ethan replied honestly. "This house needs music and laughter again. It needs someone young and brave and good-hearted to fill up all the empty spaces. But what about my father? What if he comes looking for me?" Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "Your father gave up his rights to you when he abandoned you at the church. As far as I'm concerned, you're my son now if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with significance and possibility. Nathan stared at Ethan for a long moment, his eyes bright with tears of joy. "Does that mean I can call you Pa?" he asked softly. Ethan's throat tightened with emotion. For 2 years he'd thought he would never hear that word again, never know the simple joy of being called father by a child who loved him. "I'd be honored if you would," he managed to say. Nathan's smile was radiant as he hugged Ethan again, this time with the fierce love of a son for his father. In that moment, surrounded by the music and memories that filled the old farmhouse, both of them understood that they had found something precious and healing in each other. The tumor was gone, the surgery was a success, and Nathan would live to see many more sunrises over the Kansas prairie. But more than that, they had both discovered that families aren't always born. Sometimes they're chosen, created from love and mutual need and the simple human desire to belong somewhere. As they made their way back to Nathan's room, the boy leaning on his new father for support, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known since Sarah and Joseph died. The house still held memories of loss and grief, but now it held promises of the future as well, of music lessons and birthday celebrations, of Christmas mornings and quiet evenings by the fire. Nathan was going to live, and in living, he would bring this house back to life as well. Reessaye. Nathan's recovery proved to be as remarkable as his courage. Within a week of the surgery, he was walking carefully around the house, his steps growing stronger each day as his body healed from the trauma of the operation. The surgical site closed cleanly under Samuel's watchful care, and the constant pain that had been Nathan's unwelcome companion for months became nothing more than a fading memory. But it was the transformation in Ethan that truly amazed those who knew him. The broken man who had spent 2 years drowning his sorrows in whiskey and self-pity seemed to disappear overnight, replaced by someone who rose each morning with purpose and hope. His hands no longer trembled, his eyes no longer held that haunted emptiness, and his voice carried warmth where once there had been only bitter resignation. "It's like watching a resurrection," Gabriel observed to Samuel one afternoon as they stood on the porch watching Ethan and Nathan work together in the garden. The boy moved slowly but steadily, his back straight and pain-free for the first time in months, while Ethan guided him through the delicate work of transplanting seedlings. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've seen healing take many forms in my practice, but I've never seen anything quite like this. They're both different people than they were 3 weeks ago." Indeed, the change was evident to anyone who visited the farmhouse. The windows sparkled with cleanliness. The floors gleamed from Nathan's careful attention, and music once again drifted from the parlor in the evenings. Most remarkably, laughter had returned to rooms that had known only silence and sorrow for too long. Nathan had thrown himself into recovery with the same determination he'd shown in facing his illness. He followed Ethan's medical instructions religiously, ate the nourishing meals they prepared together, and gradually increased his activity as his strength returned. But more than that, he had embraced his new role as son with a joy that was infectious. "Pa," he called one morning as Ethan reviewed medical journals in his office. "Mrs. Henderson is here with fresh bread, and she wants to check my incision again." The word still sent a warm shock through Ethan's system every time he heard it. Nathan had taken to calling him Pa with natural ease, as if the word had been waiting on his tongue for someone worthy to receive it. Miss Henderson's examinations had become a weekly ritual, though they were no longer strictly necessary from a medical standpoint. The woman had grown genuinely fond of Nathan during his recovery, and her visits provided an excuse to fuss over him with the maternal attention he'd been lacking for so long. "The scar is healing beautifully," she announced after her examination, running gentle fingers along the thin line that marked where Ethan's scalpel had saved Nathan's life. "In a few months, you'll barely be able to see it." Nathan twisted to look at his reflection in the mirror Ethan held up for him. The angry red wound had faded to a pale pink line that curved gracefully across his back, a reminder of how close he'd come to death and how far he'd traveled back to life. "Will it always be there?" he asked, tracing the scar with careful fingers. "Always," Ethan confirmed. "But scars aren't something to be ashamed of, Nathan. They're proof that you survived something difficult, that you were strong enough to heal." Nathan considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. "Then I guess it's like a badge of courage, isn't it?" "Exactly like that," Ethan agreed, pride evident in his voice. As spring melted into summer, Nathan's strength continued to improve. He grew taller and filled out the hollow-cheeked gauntness of illness, giving way to the healthy robustness of a boy who was finally able to eat without pain and sleep without fear. His complexion lost its sickly pallor, replaced by the golden tan of someone who spent time outdoors without the burden of constant suffering. The garden he'd started became a source of particular pride. What had begun as a simple desire to plant something beautiful had grown into a thriving collection of vegetables, herbs, and flowers that provided both practical benefit and aesthetic pleasure. Nathan tended it with the devotion of someone who understood the miracle of growth and renewal. "Look, Pa," he called excitedly one July morning, holding up a perfect tomato he'd just picked. "It's the first one to ripen completely." Ethan admired the fruit with appropriate solemnity, understanding that this represented far more than a simple garden success. For Nathan, each plant that flourished was proof that he had a future that he would be around long enough to see. Seeds become harvest. "We'll have it for lunch," Ethan decided. "The first tomato of the season deserves a place of honor on our table." Their meals had become celebratory affairs, not because the food was particularly elaborate, but because each shared dinner represented another day of life, another evening of companionship, another opportunity to build the family they'd both chosen. Nathan had proven to be a surprisingly good cook for someone so young, and he took genuine pleasure in preparing dishes that pleased his adopted father. The townspeople had embraced Nathan's recovery with an enthusiasm that touched both father and son. Visitors came regularly, bringing small gifts and staying for conversations that grew longer as Nathan's strength improved. Judge Morrison brought law books for Nathan to read, convinced that the boy's quick mind and natural sense of justice made him perfect candidate for legal studies. Mrs. Miller insisted on teaching him to bake bread, declaring that every young man should know how to fend for himself in the kitchen. But it was the music that truly marked Nathan's return to full health. As his energy increased, so did his time at the piano, and the melodies that flowed from his fingers grew increasingly complex and beautiful. He had not only mastered all of Joseph's incomplete compositions, but had begun creating new pieces that reflected his own experiences and emotions. One evening in late July, as they sat together in the parlor after dinner, Nathan played something Ethan had never heard before. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with themes of loss and hope, darkness and light endings, and new beginnings. "What is that?" Ethan asked when the last notes faded into silence. Nathan's cheeks colored slightly with embarrassment. "I call it the healing song. I've been working on it since the surgery, trying to capture what it felt like to wake up without pain for the first time in so long." "It's extraordinary," Ethan said softly. "Joseph would have been amazed by your talent." Nathan's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you think he knows about the surgery, about us becoming a family?" It was a question that had occurred to Ethan many times since Nathan's recovery began. He'd found himself talking to Joseph in his mind, sharing news of Nathan's progress, and the joy the boy had brought back into the house they'd both loved. "I think he knows," Ethan said carefully, "and I think he's happy that his home is filled with music and laughter again." "I dream about him sometimes," Nathan confided. "Not the strange dreams I had before, but peaceful ones. He shows me things about the house, about you, about his mother. It's like he's teaching me how to be part of this family." The simple statement brought tears to Ethan's eyes. The idea that his son was somehow helping Nathan understand his place in their reconstructed family felt both miraculous and perfectly natural. As summer progressed, Nathan's integration into the community became complete. He helped at the church with Gabriel learning to assist with services and tend to the small cemetery behind the building. He spent afternoons with Samuel absorbing medical knowledge with the same enthusiasm he'd once brought to music and gardening. Most importantly, he and Ethan worked together to restore the farmhouse to its former glory, their combined efforts transforming it from a shrine to loss into a home filled with promise. The physical changes were dramatic. Fresh paint brightened rooms that had been shrouded in dust and neglect. Curtains that had hung limp and gray were washed and rehung, allowing sunlight to stream through windows that sparkled from Nathan's careful attention. The floors gleamed from regular care, and furniture that had been covered with sheets for 2 years was restored to daily use. But the emotional transformation was even more profound. Conversations filled spaces where silence had reigned. Plans for the future replaced brooding over the past. Hope displaced despair in hearts that had learned to expect nothing but disappointment. "We should throw a party," Nathan suggested one evening as they worked together on refinishing the front porch. "A celebration to mark my full recovery and to thank everyone who helped during the surgery." Ethan paused in his sanding, considering the idea. The thought of hosting a gathering would have been unthinkable just months before, but now it seemed not only possible but appropriate. "What kind of party?" he asked. Nathan's eyes lit up with excitement. "A harvest celebration. We could invite everyone who's been so kind to us, serve food from our garden, and I could play some of the new pieces I've been working on." The enthusiasm in the boy's voice was infectious. Ethan found himself imagining the farmhouse filled with neighbors and friends, alive with conversation and music and the simple joy of community. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he agreed. "When should we have it?" "September," Nathan said promptly. "When the vegetables are at their peak and the weather is perfect for outdoor entertaining." They spent the rest of the summer planning their celebration. Nathan throwing himself into the preparations with the same determination he'd brought to his recovery. He practiced new pieces for the musical entertainment, helped Ethan plan a menu that would showcase their garden's bounty, and personally delivered invitations to everyone who had shown them kindness during the dark days of his illness. The response was overwhelmingly positive. It seemed the entire town was eager to celebrate Nathan's recovery and to see the Callaway farmhouse come alive again. Offers of help poured in. Mrs. Henderson volunteered to organize the ladies' contributions to the meal. Samuel offered to bring his wife's famous apple pies, and Gabriel insisted on providing the blessing that would formally mark the occasion. As the day of the party approached, Nathan's excitement became palpable. He cleaned the house from top to bottom, arranged flowers from the garden in every room, and practiced his musical program until every note was perfect. But more than that, he seemed to glow with the deep satisfaction of someone who had not only survived a terrible ordeal, but had emerged from it stronger and more grateful for life's blessings. "I keep thinking about how different everything could have been," he confided to Ethan the night before the celebration. "If Reverend Wilson hadn't brought me here, if you hadn't been willing to try the surgery, if your hands hadn't been steady enough to save me." "But all of those things did happen," Ethan pointed out. "And here we are preparing to celebrate with friends and neighbors who've become family." Nathan nodded, his expression serious with the weight of gratitude. "I know how lucky I am, Pa, not just to be alive, but to have found you, to have a real home again." The words hit Ethan with their simple honesty. Looking at this remarkable boy, healthy, happy, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and wanted, Ethan could barely remember the broken man he'd been just months before. "I'm the lucky one," he said softly. "You gave me back my life, Nathan. You reminded me that healing others is what I was meant to do." The harvest celebration proved to be everything they'd hoped for, and more. Neighbors arrived throughout the afternoon, filling the farmhouse and spilling out onto the porch and into the yard. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by the community: fresh bread, preserved fruits, roasted meats, and vegetables that spoke of the prairie's abundance. Children who had been Nathan's age when he first arrived now played games on the lawn, while their parents gathered in small groups to share news and gossip. The elderly settled into comfortable chairs on the porch, content to watch the festivities and comment on how well Nathan looked, how much the house had improved, how good it was to see Dr. Callaway smiling again. Nathan moved through the crowd with grace beyond his years, thanking each guest personally for their support during his illness and recovery. He showed particular attention to those who had been most helpful, spending extra time with Mrs. Henderson, who had fussed over him like a grandmother, and with Samuel, who had risked his professional reputation to assist with the surgery. But it was when he sat down at the piano to provide the evening's entertainment that the true magic of the celebration revealed itself. The parlor filled to capacity as Nathan began to play, his fingers moving across the keys with confidence and skill that left his audience breathless. He started with simple melodies that everyone knew, encouraging singing along and creating a sense of community participation. Then he moved to the pieces he'd learned from Joseph's collection, playing them with a reverence that honored the boy who had written them while making them his own through interpretation and understanding. Finally, he played his original compositions, the completed version of Joseph's birthday song for Sarah, followed by the healing song he'd written to capture his own journey from illness to health. The music was so beautiful, so filled with emotion and gratitude, that several people in the audience wiped away tears as the melodies washed over them. When the last notes faded into silence, the applause was thunderous. Nathan stood and bowed with the dignity of a concert performer, his face glowing with the simple joy of sharing his gift with people who appreciated it. Speech. Someone called from the back of the room, and the cry was quickly taken up by others. Nathan looked momentarily flustered by the request, but Gabriel stepped forward to provide encouragement. "I think we'd all like to hear from our young host," the Reverend said gently. Nathan cleared his throat and looked out over the assembled crowd, friends and neighbors who had become his extended family, people who had supported him through the darkest period of his life and who were now here to celebrate his recovery. "I'm not very good at speeches," he began, his voice clear, despite his nervousness. "But I wanted to thank all of you for what you've done for Pa and me. When I first came here, I was scared and sick and didn't think I had much time left. But you welcomed me anyway, and you supported Pa when he decided to try something that seemed impossible." He paused, looking directly at Ethan, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Most of all, I want to thank the man who saved my life in more ways than one. Pa didn't just remove a tumor from my back. He gave me a family, a home, and a future I never thought I'd have. He taught me that families aren't just about blood. They're about choice and love and the decision to stand by each other no matter what." The room was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something profound and precious. "So this party isn't just about celebrating my recovery," Nathan continued. "It's about celebrating all the ways that people can heal each other when they choose love over fear, hope over despair, and community over isolation." He looked out over the crowd again, his young face radiant with gratitude and joy. "Thank you for being part of our family. Thank you for proving that miracles still happen when good people come together to help someone in need." The applause that followed was different from before, deeper, more heartfelt, touched with the recognition that they had all been part of something extraordinary. As people began to move forward to offer personal congratulations and thanks, Ethan felt his chest swell with pride for this remarkable boy who had become his son. Later that evening, after the last guest had departed and they'd finished cleaning up from the celebration, Nathan and Ethan sat together on the front porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The boy was tired but happy, still glowing from the success of their party and the outpouring of love from their community. "Pa," Nathan said quietly, "do you think my mother would have been proud of how I turned out?" Ethan looked at this extraordinary young man, brave, thoughtful, generous of spirit despite everything he'd endured, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "She would have been incredibly proud," he said firmly. "You've become exactly the kind of person she hoped you'd be when she taught you to read music and see beauty in small things." Nathan smiled, leaning against Ethan's shoulder with the comfortable affection of a child secure in his father's love. "And what about Joseph? Do you think he would have liked having a brother?" The question touched something deep in Ethan's heart. For 2 years, he'd preserved Joseph's memory like a shrine, afraid that letting anyone else into his life would somehow diminish his love for his first son. But Nathan had taught him that the heart's capacity for love wasn't limited, that honoring the past didn't mean closing the door to the future. "I think Joseph would have adored you," he said softly. "He always wanted a brother, someone to share adventures with and teach things to. He would have loved having you here." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and watching the endless expanse of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon. It was peaceful and perfect, a moment of contentment that neither of them would ever forget. "Nathan," Ethan said eventually, "I want you to know that adopting you legally is just a formality. You've been my son from the moment you trusted me enough to let me try to save your life." Nathan turned to look at him, his eyes bright with tears of joy. "And you've been my real father since you first promised to be there when I woke up from surgery. Blood doesn't make a family pa, love does." As they made their way inside and prepared for bed, both of them understood that they had found something precious and irreplaceable in each other. Nathan had been given a second chance at life, and Ethan had been given a second chance at being a father. Together, they had created a family built on choice and commitment, on shared struggles and mutual support, on the simple truth that healing often comes through helping others heal. The farmhouse settled around them with the satisfied creaks and sighs of a home that had found its purpose again. Music lived in its rooms once more, laughter echoed through its halls, and love filled all the spaces that grief had once claimed. Nathan Rivers Callaway fell asleep that night knowing he was safe, loved, and home at last. And Ethan Callaway rested peacefully for the first time in years, his heart full of gratitude for the dying child who had taught him how to live again.